Hi, Diana. Thank you so much for joining me over here today. So, I want to start a conversation because I know we're going to be talking all about like martial arts and language learning and linguistics and all of that. But could you share a little bit of your background in linguistics and in Taekwondo?
I've been doing Taekwondo now for about 3.5 years. And as for linguistics, I'm minoring in it in college. So I've been studying that for maybe a little less than 2 years right now.
So you're studying both of them, and
Yes.
it's like my karate. We've been doing our martial arts, I think, for about the same amount of time, and different arts and different friends and different all of that. But I get it, like studying. You're never really an expert in something. There's always more to learn, no matter how far you get, no matter how good you are at anything. Even for myself, there's always more and more and more to go. But I feel like, especially from our conversation, I can tell that you really know at least your process for your language learning and for your martial arts studies and for just really are aware of how you learn. So I think that would be a nice place to start here is how martial arts and language learning are related and like how the self-awareness aspect really comes into like, knowing your own learning style and making time to study and, doing things in a way that you will know you will get them done. How do you do that for yourself? So what's your process for studying, whether it's for language learning or for martial art?
I think when you're trying to learn anything, the process is really similar. I think by learning languages and trying my best to research the most useful ways to do it, it sort of helped me be better at learning the martial arts aspects as well.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, one thing I really like to do is spaced repetition. I like to learn something new and put a lot of effort into that while making sure to review old things a little bit. And then every once in a while, after I kind of master something, I'll only maybe review it once in a while. But for things that I'm still learning, I try to review those at least 1 or 2 times, preferably every single day. I think that the processes are really, really similar. It's not really about how good of a memory you have. It's more so about making sure you have consistency with anything you're learning, having the
Mm-hmm.
consistency to practice it every single day, and making sure you retain old material while focusing heavily on new material. I feel like that's my biggest focus when it comes to making sure I remember anything from new vocabulary to in a language to different forms in Taekwondo.
Yeah, and I agree. And I'm thinking about as you're saying that, it's like in my karate classes and like in my study, it really has taught me that. And for the spaced repetition, you have to have all of the pieces, all of the forms, all of the techniques, everything as you're moving forward. Even though maybe you're learning something new, you still have to have the foundational skills. And I know that those skills have transferred into my language learning. And, that's why I like Linguist Dojo. That's where that name, how I came up with it for my course. But how those come together, because I think that a lot of people, especially in language learning, they focus on just the newest thing and the newest concept. And then the older skills, they begin to disappear because they're not practiced. And it's the same, martial arts. Like we have our beginners classes and we have our advanced classes, and sometimes the advanced students go to both. They go to the beginner classes so that they can practice those skills because they still need them. So it's the same practice, and I don't know, I guess it would be nice if we could integrate even more of that into language learning. Like if we could have and you kind of do, when you go into reading and writing and like speaking and listening, you do use all those pieces. But I wonder how we could integrate more of those elements in of the spaced repetition within our lessons. Because like when you go to school, for your classes, and you go through and it's mostly new concepts.
Yeah.
But I guess you do that for yourself though, right? You add in the repetition, the review of those other concepts, your
I
own
notice
practice.
with both my Taekwondo or studying Korean, I think it's up to the learner to have to review their old material. I
Mm-hmm.
think when you're taking a Korean class, you know that they're going to focus on new material because they need to teach you new things.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go to a Taekwondo class, you know they're going to teach you new material because you need new material for your belt test. I think there's this belief that Well, one, I think that the teachers don't really expect you to want to review things you already know. But two, I think the teachers also don't think they have a reason to review it. They know that you know it already, and they
Mhm.
know they have to teach you new things.
Mhm.
And I guess it's like you can't really learn the new things on your own theoretically, but the
Mhm.
older things, it's sort of your responsibility to review it. I think a lot of times when people are students, they have this sort of misconception that they can fully rely on their teachers to teach them everything from new stuff to even just reviewing old stuff and making sure they know everything they need to.
Mhm.
But I think that's when personal responsibility comes into play. And it's important to realize that your teachers aren't necessarily teaching you and reviewing with you everything you need to know at that moment. They're teaching you the newest things that you need to know, but it's still your responsibility to review the old things, even if it's just once a day, once a week. I don't
As much
think,
as you can, yeah.
yes, I don't even think once a day is necessary. I think if you're just doing spaced repetition, if you're just reviewing something that you already know really well, but you're trying not to forget it, even just once a week's enough, really,
Mhm.
just so it doesn't leave your mind.
Yeah, and I agree. And that is something like I think that you said that really well. That is the student's job. Like that's where the independent work comes in. And I think that that is a very important concept because you have the people who want to take classes who are like they want the teacher to teach them, and then you have some people who want to learn everything on their own. And some people need more or less support than others, but ideally like you need those skills to learn on your own, and then you also need new concepts coming in. So that's I think really where that independent study comes in and where people come in because they think like you were saying, they think like, oh, I'm in a class, I don't have to do anything else, I just do the class and then I learn everything. But they don't, or they become overwhelmed by, at least I know I have, like you become overwhelmed by having so much to do and so much to review. But if you just jump in and just choose something to start reviewing, like if it's martial arts, like you choose one form to practice, like for that to review, like okay, I'm going to review one each day or one each week is going to be my focus to improve. Or language learning, I'm going to do something of my own practice each week to improve. It is enough, even if it's only a little bit. And I think the overwhelm is also really a factor here for that. How do you feel about that? How do you approach, like when you go into learning something, when you have all of these tasks to do? How do you decide how do you prioritize and how do you get started? What is your process for that?
If I'm learning new material, I try to focus on whatever I think is the most important. With Taekwondo, usually between each belt, we have a set of things we have to know. A martial arts form, a kicking form, a self-defense. I think that was it, if I'm not mistaken. So usually I'll pick one of those. Maybe I'll start with the martial arts form because that's sort of the standard that you're expected to know. Because for the Taekwondo schools, the kicking form and the self-defense is sort of based on the school, but the martial arts forms are just globally chosen. I consider them very important to know, so I prioritize that. And as for Korean, I'll prefer to focus on vocab or grammar that I think is more useful to me. Things that I can see myself being more likely to use, I tend to put more effort into.
Mhm.
And things that I don't have to know as well, things that I might only have to know for a test or some such, I might put a little focus into it, but I don't try to overdo it because if it's not going to benefit me with real life usage, it's not as important. And then when it comes to reviewing old material, I think the most important thing is to not overwhelm yourself by trying to do too much at once. I think it's important to pick small things and focus on
Mhm.
that, but also it's easier to not think of it like a task. Like with Korean, I don't sit down with a textbook and open up my first ever Korean textbook and go through all the grammar and vocab I'm maybe forgetting. I prefer to either A, there's my spaced repetition flashcards, Anki, which is really good
Oh,
since
okay.
if you use that, it becomes less and less over time. The reviews, I mean. So
Mhm.
it's not overwhelming. But
Mhm.
also, I think the most important thing with language is just incorporating it into your life. I
Mhm.
don't think I need to review basics very much. And the reason I think my basics are somewhat solid and I don't feel myself forgetting them very often is because oftentimes I like to do things like go on social media, maybe find people, chat with them Korean over text, use a lot of the basics since that those are the things that come really easily to me, a lot more easily than having to think about harder vocab, harder grammar. And because I'm constantly trying to find times to just send little messages to maybe new Koreans I meet online, Korean people I know already. Sometimes even the other day, I go into my Taekwondo dojo and I'll just approach my grandmaster and just speak with him in a little Korean. It's nothing complicated. I'll just say things like, oh, I'm going, or oh, I just finished cleaning this thing, therefore I can go now, or oh, how are you? The weather's nice today, or even giving a little suggestion, nothing too complicated, but by at least approaching people like that and speaking with basics, I'm able to remember them, practice those basics, and also it's a lot more fun than having to open up a textbook and having to review manually. I think textbook learning is more necessary for me when it comes to things that I can't see myself being able to use yet. But when it comes to material that I already know pretty well, I think it's more enjoyable and more effective to just try to actually use it than to just keep reviewing it as if it's material in a textbook that I don't know yet.
So it's almost like what you use for spaced repetition, like practicing those skills. It like gets phased out after a while, not needing to go back and practice it, like practice those specific skills because you begin to use them in conversation or in writing or in any of those skills. Like how we learn the alphabet, you know, when we're kids. We learn it and we have to do all of those drills and like sentences and we have to do all of those and we have to practice them explicitly. But then, you know, like now we don't practice we don't practice the alphabet, we don't practice words, but we still use them when we're speaking and writing, and like, you know, we still have to use them. So like with your Korean studies, because you're right at the point where you're, it sounds like at least like going into like the intermediate to advanced state, like you're like right on that verge there.
It's really hard to decipher. Maybe I'm somewhere near beginning intermediate.
Okay. Yeah, but it sounds like definitely like somewhere around that intermediate stage, like, and it's really interesting to witness because you can see the shift from like all of the memorization in the beginning because it is a lot. You know, when you start a new language, it's just like when you started Taekwondo. You know, you go in and you're like, okay, what is this? How does it work? What are forms? What are techniques? What are all these things? And then as you progress further, you still use all of those concepts, but you use them differently. And it sounds like you're spending less time with memorization, like you're still doing memorization techniques, but you're shifting more toward application.
Exactly. Maybe with the older material that I know better. With newer material, there's still this constant need to study it because I don't know it very well. But I think with the older material, the ones that you used all the time, tons of practice with it, at some point it would feel almost like a waste of time to still have to study it since you pretty much know it well. That's the perfect material to actually try to use, and trying to use it quickly, I think, is really important. I find myself feeling like there's some material that takes me time to think, and other material that I could sort of just use really quickly. And I think any material that I could think of quickly is material I should be practicing speaking or writing. Material that takes me time to think a lot, I should be studying. And material that takes me a moment to think is material that I should be attempting to output because it'll help me ingrain it into my head better than just studying it.
That's a really clear like example of how to decide how you should approach different material, and I can see that from both the like the linguistic perspective and the martial arts perspective with that. And it's really nice because once you get that material going, like once you get sort of past the memorization stage, that's kind of the beauty of it, is that you still use it, but you use it differently, and you even can go back and like use it to practice some of the beginning stages and integrate aspects of it in. Like when you learn a new form, like it still uses all of the pieces, all of the techniques and the movements that you've learned before. They're just in a different combination, and you maybe have something new that comes in, and you know, you have a new form, you have a new technique that comes in, but for the most part you have the foundation and you are just using it in a different structure. Like with language, you know, you have all of those foundations, the grammar and the vocabulary, but each sentence is different. Each sentence is constructed differently. So you have that just new usage of it, and there's always another level you can take it to. And that is practice. Even if you're not memorizing, even if you're practicing it, that still is practice. And you can bring in some of those new words into your writing or your speaking as a way to use them in application, and then also still have some memorization.
Yeah, even though they're slightly different, I do think when it comes to the process of not wanting to forget old material and letting it stack upon each other, martial arts and language learning are very similar. I think something very common that I see in both language learning and martial arts, but very especially in martial arts, is like what you were saying earlier, when people want to keep progressing, but they don't really want to focus as much on old material. It's very common that when we're progressing people, let's say through color belts, that will focus only on what they need for their next belt test and will completely stop reviewing their old material. Maybe once in a while we'll occasionally review stuff, but it's so infrequent that it's not enough to properly execute the reviewing process. So they still end up not really remembering it. And I guess part of the issue with that is that when the students are Bodan, which is the last belt before the black belt, they're expected to know all of their material that they've ever learned for the past 3 years since their white belt, and they have to know certain parts of it for their black belt test. And even though usually color belts have 3 months between each belt test, Bodans have 6 months to be a Bodan before their black belt test, potentially. It depends when you become a Bodan. Some people have 3 months, some have 4, some have 5. It depends. But typically, they try to give you more than the standard color belt since you have to go over everything. And I think the reason for that is just because since students aren't constantly reviewing their old material, at least not enough, they tend to forget almost everything. And even though they could learn it again somewhat quickly, they still have so much to review that it's very overwhelming that they have to have a good at least 3 to 6 month span to do that. And I know why we do it that way, but personally, I don't like the idea of forgetting my old material. So I always made sure to constantly slightly review old material while still learning new material. And even similarly to that, there's this common trend where when people become black belts, they tend to quit because they sort of feel like they reached the end.
Like I
Like they
did.
learned, yeah, they feel like they think they learned everything because they learned their 8 forms, their kicking forms, their self-defense, their black belt. And sometimes people who don't do martial arts don't realize that black belt has degrees to it, different levels. They think that maybe, oh, black belt is the end. That's the big
Yeah.
belt. And it's not to say black belt is not an accomplishment. Of course, it's an accomplishment. But I like to say that I look at martial arts like a video game. I think your color belts, from your white belt to your Bodan, is sort of like the tutorial of the video game, where you're learning the basics, you're learning how it works, but it's not the game itself. It's just the the beginning part. And then I think when you're a first degree black belt, when you just get your black belt, it's like the level 1 of the video game, where you finally know the mechanics of the game, you know what you're supposed to do, and now you're supposed to really start executing that. So I think there's just a common misconception in martial arts where people like to stop when they hit their black belt because they think that's the end. But in reality, it's more like the beginning. And with each degree, you get higher and higher into the levels. Taekwondo has about 9 belts in total, which, could take decades to actually get them all.
A lifetime. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. A lot of times, even Taekwondo school owners might be like a 7th degree, which is still a grandmaster. But when you think about how they have 2 belts left, and those belts could take many, many years to still get, you realize that even your masters are still learning too. It's a lifelong
Yeah.
process. And actually, almost no masters even get all the way through the belts. When you think of it that way, you realize, just how little you actually know.
Yeah, there's
It's a
so much.
lifelong process, just like language learning. Even native speakers don't really fully know their language well. Even us, we're still technically learning English to some
Yeah,
extent.
we're English learners too, even though we're both native speakers of the language. Yeah, especially as like a linguistics student, I'm sure at least I know when I started studying linguistics that I went back there, like, whoa, this is my language. Like I didn't know my language before I went into it, because you learn all of the intricacies, and you also just go to new levels within it. You go to, like, there's always ways to improve your speaking ability and your writing ability, like especially your output skills. But yeah, there's just so many levels. And you mentioned with Taekwondo that you guys have the tests on your skill, like you test for your next belt and you just test on the new materials?
Yes.
Okay, so that's how we're a little bit different, like in karate, because we test on everything every time. And I think that's probably why it takes a little bit longer. But our tests, like my last test was like a few hours long, because every test we tested on everything so far. And it slows people down, and not very many people get to black belt. So it's kind of like, it'd be nice to have that within, like, which it sounds like you did that for yourself. Like you didn't have like test on everything, but you still made sure that you had everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, not only is it just because I feel like it's what I owe myself, but also since I'm a member of our leadership program, I feel as though there's an expectancy that I should know it, because I call leadership program sort of like an internship, because I help, but it's not exactly a job. I'm expected to show up and assist. And if I get told, okay, these students are doing this form, go help them, I'm expected to know the form. And I think that's standard. I think that as a black belt, if I'm asked any sort of color belt material, I do think that it is my job to know that material. I don't think I have much reason to not know it. I know sometimes people forget the material, and I understand that as long as they can review it quickly and remember it. But I think if you completely forget old material, it's probably not that good, because when you progress, you're trying to say, I am everything that I was before plus more. But how can you say that if you forget it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just a constant process of trying to balance, bringing in new material, maintaining the old material, and having, a little bit of growth, like continuing to progress, but still maintaining everything. Because if you don't maintain everything, there's only so much that you can progress, and it's just constant. And I feel like there's this, there's always more to add to that, and there's just so much. But I think we'll wrap up here, because we're getting close to the end of our conversation. And you guys can leave comments down below, and at least I will be in the comments, and I'm responding to you guys' comments and anything that comes up around these topics. And yeah, this was a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me for it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.